New York City, 1931. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and jazz. Speakeasies hum beneath the surface of Prohibition America, where liquor flows in shadows and every handshake hides a deal. In the dim backrooms of Manhattan's Lower East Side, a young man with piercing eyes and a calm, calculating presence sits across from men twice his age. His name, Charles Lucky Luciano. He doesn't look like a killer. He doesn't need to. His power isn't in brute force, it's in vision. In a world ruled by old codes and violent egos, Luciano is about to rewrite the entire system. This is not just the story of a gangster. It's the story of a revolution, the birth of an empire built not with ideals but with instincts. In the early decades of the 20th century, the Mafia was a messy, blood-soaked collection of tribes. Old world bosses, the Mustache Petes, still clung to Sicilian traditions of honor, pride, and secrecy. They ruled through fear, spoke only their dialect, and treated America as a foreign land. Their world was small, limited to family, vendetta, and superstition. But America was changing. Cities were swelling with immigrants, industry, and opportunity, legal or otherwise. The streets no longer belonged to just one people or one code. The old ways were crumbling, and in their place, something new was being born, a modern underworld. At the heart of this transformation stood Lucky Luciano. To understand him, you have to strip away the legend, the cigar smoke, the slick suits, the whispered myth of the American Godfather. What remains is a man shaped by poverty, prejudice, and a relentless hunger for control. Luciano wasn't born powerful. He earned it, one scar at a time. A child of Sicilian immigrants, he learned early that respect wasn't given, it was taken. Beaten by cops, exploited by gang bosses, betrayed by friends, he learned to trust only calculation. Every gesture, every alliance, was a move on a chessboard where survival was the only prize. He saw something others didn't. He realized that chaos, the endless gang wars, betrayals, and vendettas, wasn't strength. It was weakness. It was bad for business. If crime was to endure, it had to evolve. It had to be organized. So while others killed for pride, Luciano planned for power. His genius wasn't in violence, it was in vision. He saw the Mafia as more than a gang. He saw it as an enterprise, a business, a system. Under his leadership, murder became management, loyalty became policy, and corruption became infrastructure. He took the chaos of the streets and gave it order, a corporate structure with a criminal soul. This documentary isn't about glorifying Luciano, it's about dissecting him. Because behind the glamour of the mob boss lies something more disturbing and more fascinating. Luciano didn't just build an empire of crime. He engineered a philosophy of power. A system where fear, profit, and silence replaced faith and law. Where loyalty wasn't sacred, it was transactional. He didn't just change the Mafia. He changed the very nature of power in America. When politicians spoke of morality, Luciano whispered in their ears. When judges preached justice, he owned their streets. He blurred the line between crime and capitalism, between the underworld and the boardroom. The man they called Lucky was not lucky at all, he was deliberate. Every betrayal, every alliance, every murder was a step toward something larger. He created what historians would later call the Commission, the first nationwide governing body of organized crime, a criminal congress that operated like Wall Street in the shadows. But every empire, no matter how brilliantly constructed, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. And Luciano's world was built on deception, on men who would one day turn on him, on systems that would collapse under their own greed. Still, his legacy endures. The structure he built remains the blueprint for modern organized crime, from New York to Naples, from Las Vegas to Hong Kong. His code still echoes in the rituals of power, in the silence of those who profit from control. In this story, we'll trace his journey, from a poor Sicilian boy in the ghettos of New York to the architect of America's underworld. We'll explore the wars he fought, the alliances he built, and the betrayals that brought him down. But above all, we'll look inside the psychology of a man who didn't just break the rules, he rewrote them. Because to understand Lucky Luciano is to understand something darker about human ambition itself. The desire not just to survive, but to control the world that tried to destroy you. This is not just a crime story. It's a story about transformation, how one man's vision turned chaos into empire, and how the echoes of that vision still shape power today. Welcome to the birth of an empire. The story of the man who made crime an institution, and changed America forever. Before Lucky Luciano could rise, the world he was born into had to fall apart. To understand his revolution, we must first enter the shadowy, violent, and deeply traditional world that existed before him. A world ruled not by logic but by loyalty, fear, and old country pride. At the turn of the 20th century, the American underworld was a battlefield of tribes. Italian, Irish, and Jewish gangs carved up neighborhoods block by block, each one protecting its scraps of territory with blood. But among them, one name carried a whisper of something ancient: the Mafia. It had begun long before New York, long before America. In Sicily, the Mafia had grown out of poverty and oppression, a shadow government that filled the void left by corruption and foreign rule. It was built on silence, honor, and family. Its code, omerta, demanded absolute loyalty and total secrecy. Justice was personal, revenge was sacred, and power came not from wealth but from fear. When Italian immigrants brought that tradition to America, they found a new world that didn't care for their codes. The old bosses, men known as the Mustache Petes, tried to recreate their Sicilian order in a country that was already industrialized, restless, and ruthless. They saw America as foreign soil, a place to exploit but never to belong to. Their loyalty wasn't to business, it was to blood. They refused to work with outsiders. They refused to adapt. They demanded tribute, obedience, and respect, even as the streets around them changed. In neighborhoods like Little Italy and East Harlem, these bosses ruled like feudal lords. They ran protection rackets, gambling dens, and extortion rings. Their soldiers collected payments from local shopkeepers and bootleggers, ensuring that every coin passed through the hands of the old guard. But their power came at a cost. They fought among themselves constantly, over pride, territory, and slights that might seem invisible to outsiders. Every insult was an act of war. Every handshake could hide a dagger. And every funeral brought another cycle of revenge. The result was chaos, a fractured underworld constantly tearing itself apart. Prohibition changed everything. When America outlawed alcohol in 1920, it opened a floodgate of opportunity. Bootlegging, the production and sale of illegal liquor, became the most profitable enterprise in the country. Suddenly, gangs were no longer just neighborhood nuisances, they were empires in the making. But the old mafia bosses weren't built for this new scale of crime. They didn't understand logistics, supply chains, or partnerships beyond their bloodlines. They ruled with superstition, not strategy. They believed the old codes would protect them in a new world driven by capitalism. And into that confusion stepped a new generation. Young men who had grown up in America, who spoke English as fluently as Sicilian, who saw opportunity instead of tradition. Men like Salvatore Lucania, later known as Lucky Luciano. He watched these old men, with their waxed mustaches, their long coats, and their Sicilian rituals, and saw weakness. They clung to an outdated honor system that could no longer survive in the concrete jungle of New York. While they waged vendettas over insults, others, Irish bootleggers like Auntie Madden, Jewish syndicates like Arnold Rothstein's, were turning crime into big business. Luciano realized that power in America wasn't about pride, it was about organization. But before he could build something new, the old world had to destroy itself. The early 1930s would bring what historians call the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict between two of the most powerful mafia factions. Joe, the boss Masuria, who represented the old guard, and Salvatore Maranzano, who claimed to be the rightful heir of the Sicilian tradition. For nearly 2 years, New York streets ran red with blood. Ambushes, betrayals, and assassinations became daily news. Ordinary citizens whispered that the city was cursed. Politicians promised justice. The police pretended to act. But the war raged on, a silent storm that only those inside could truly understand. To the Mustache Petes, it was about dominance. To Luciano, it was about opportunity. He watched both sides exhaust themselves, watched as their paranoia and pride blinded them to the changing world. In their desperation to protect their thrones, they were creating the perfect opening for someone young, clever, and ruthless enough to take them all down. It wasn't just about taking power, it was about redefining it. Luciano's genius would come not from winning the war, but from ending it. He envisioned something no one else did, a mafia without borders, without ethnic walls, without endless blood feuds. A structure where profit replaced pride. A system where order could finally emerge from chaos. But that vision was still years away. For now, the underworld was still a battlefield, and its kings were dinosaurs, blind to extinction. In their dimly lit social clubs, they smoked their cigars and plotted vengeance, believing they were the masters of the city. They didn't realize that, sitting in the corner, listening quietly, was the man who would bury them, not in blood but in evolution. The old mafia was about loyalty. Luciano's mafia would be about control. And as the old bosses grew older, clinging to their fading power, the young bloods, Luciano, Lansky, Siegel, Costello, were waiting in the shadows, ready to inherit the underworld. The fall of the Mustache Pete's wasn't just a change in leadership. It was the death of an era, the end of the Mafia's ancient code and the beginning of a new empire. A criminal empire that would mirror America itself, efficient, ruthless, and built on the illusion of order. Before Luciano could rise, this world had to burn. And soon, it would, in a war that would pit tradition against transformation, and leave only one man standing to rebuild from the ashes. The old world was dying. And Lucky Luciano was already sharpening the knife that would cut its throat. The story of Charles Lucky Luciano does not begin in luxury or power, it begins in dirt, sweat, and fear. Before he became the architect of America's underworld, he was Salvatore Lucania, a poor immigrant boy trying to survive the chaos of early 20th century New York City. He was born in 1897 in Lercora, a dusty Sicilian village surrounded by sulfur mines and hardship. His father Antonio was a laborer, an honest man who believed in work, not crime. But honesty had no currency in Sicily and even less in America. When Salvatore was 9, his family boarded a ship for the Promised Land, the United States, chasing a dream that would soon reveal its teeth. They arrived in New York in 1906, settling in the Lower East Side, a place that looked less like paradise and more like purgatory. Tenements packed with desperate families, the air thick with smoke, sweat, and the cries of street vendors. The smell of poverty clung to everything. Disease spread faster than hope. For the Lucania family, every day was a battle for survival. Young Salvatore went to school, but the streets were his real education. He learned English quickly, not from teachers but from hustlers, card sharps, and kids who could fight. Respect wasn't given in this world, it was taken. And Salvatore was determined to take his share. He began running small errands for neighborhood gangs, delivering packages, carrying messages, keeping watch. He saw men with fine suits and fat wallets who didn't break their backs in factories like his father did. They made their money in the shadows, gambling, loan sharking, protection. To a boy living in hunger that didn't look like sin. It looked like freedom. By his teens, Salvatore had joined one of the many small-time street gangs that roamed the Lower East Side, rough, violent groups of immigrant kids trying to carve out their own piece of the city. It was there he met Meyer Lansky, a wiry Jewish boy with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of opportunity. Their friendship began with a fight, and ended with an understanding. Lansky didn't fear him. He respected him. And that respect would grow into one of the most important alliances in criminal history. Luciano's rise from street kid to feared enforcer was fast and brutal. By his late teens he was running dice games, collecting debts, and making connections with larger criminal networks. He had a gift. Not for violence, though he could be ruthless when necessary, but for organization. He understood people, what they wanted, what they feared, what they could be made to do. He learned that power wasn't about shouting. It was about control. By his early 20s, Luciano had caught the attention of powerful figures in New York's criminal underworld. Most notably, Arnold Rothstein, the infamous gambler and racketeer often credited as the father of organized crime. Rothstein saw something in the young Italian: intelligence, charm, and discipline. He took Luciano under his wing, teaching him the art of business and crime. Rothstein's lessons were simple. Never let emotion guide your hand. Violence is the last tool, not the first. Money and influence last longer than bullets. Luciano listened carefully. Those lessons would shape everything he did. During Prohibition, when the U.S. government banned alcohol, the streets of New York became a gold rush of opportunity. The thirst for liquor didn't vanish, it exploded. Speakeasies popped up everywhere and bootleggers raced to supply them. Luciano stepped into this world with precision. He built networks, bribed cops, and kept the booze flowing. But he was different from the average thug. While others fought over territory, Luciano thought about structure. He saw the inefficiency, dozens of gangs killing each other over turf when they could be working together for profit. To him, crime wasn't about ego, it was about business. By 1925 he was already a millionaire. He drove luxury cars, wore custom suits, and lived in a Manhattan apartment that looked more like a banker's than a gangster's. Yet beneath the polish he remained the same street kid who knew that power could vanish in an instant. And he was right. In 1929 Luciano's luck ran out, or so it seemed. He was kidnapped by rival gangsters, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on a Staten Island beach. He survived barely. No one knew who ordered the hit, but Luciano never spoke about it. He healed, returned to the city, and smiled like nothing happened. From that moment on, people called him Lucky. But the truth was darker. He didn't believe in luck. He believed in control. The kidnapping only hardened him. It taught him that fear was a weapon, and that survival was the purest form of power. When he came back sharper, colder, more strategic. He began building alliances beyond his own kind, something the old Sicilian bosses despised. He partnered with Jewish and Irish mobsters, seeing them not as outsiders but as equals in enterprise. It was a radical move, one that would soon change the criminal landscape forever. Luciano wasn't loyal to old codes. He was loyal to results. He didn't care where a man came from as long as he could make money and keep quiet. That mindset, modern, pragmatic, almost corporate, made him stand out. In an underworld ruled by pride and paranoia, he represented something new, efficiency. But he was also patient. He knew the old bosses still held the throne and challenging them too soon could mean death. So he played the game. He smiled at men he despised, toasted with men he planned to replace and waited. Behind the charm was calculation. Behind the handshake was strategy. In every smoky backroom and crowded speakeasy he was studying the networks, the weaknesses, the personalities. He knew that the old order was cracking under its own weight, and when it finally collapsed he would be ready. The streets had made him. The violence had shaped him. But it was the lessons of survival, the psychology of fear and loyalty, that turned Salvatore Lucania into Lucky Luciano. He was no longer just a street kid with ambition. He was an emerging architect of something far greater, a criminal system that would one day rival Wall Street itself. And as the 1920s bled into the 1930s, the boy from the tenements was no longer looking up at the city's towers. He was preparing to own them from the shadows. In the roaring 1920s, New York City was alive with contradiction, a city of jazz and prohibition, of skyscrapers and slums, of dreamers and killers. It was the decade when the American underworld stopped being a neighborhood affair and started becoming an empire. And at the center of this transformation stood a new generation, younger, sharper, and unburdened by the old codes of Sicily. Among them, three names would change everything: Charles Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Together, they would form a brotherhood unlike anything the criminal world had ever seen, an alliance that fused intellect, violence, and vision into a single, unstoppable force. Luciano and Lansky had first met years earlier on the streets of the Lower East Side, when they were just teenagers running small hustles. Their first encounter was not friendly, a gambling scuffle that nearly ended in a fight. But Lansky, even as a kid, recognized something in Luciano: calm control. And Luciano saw something in Lansky too, a mind that worked like a machine. They were opposites. Luciano was the streetwise Sicilian, smooth, charming, and magnetic. Lansky was the cerebral Jew, cautious, methodical, and analytical. Together they made a perfect balance. Lansky didn't believe in the old Sicilian obsession with bloodlines or honor. To him, crime was math, profit and loss, risk and reward. Luciano understood that instantly. The two of them began building small rackets together, gambling, bootlegging, protection, and quickly discovered that cooperation, not conflict, brought real money. Then came Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Lansky's childhood friend, a handsome and volatile enforcer with eyes that burned like gasoline. Siegel had a talent for violence and a flair for the dramatic. He was the kind of man who could kill before breakfast and charm a crowd by dinner. If Lansky was the brain and Luciano the strategist, Bugsy was the fire, the muscle and charisma that could bend men's will through fear or fascination. This trio, Luciano, Lansky, Siegel, became the nucleus of a new underworld philosophy. They didn't see themselves as gangsters. They saw themselves as businessmen. Illegal businessmen, yes, but businessmen nonetheless. They began working with, not against, rival ethnic groups. Jewish and Irish gangs, long considered outsiders by the old Sicilian dons, became partners. Luciano and Lansky saw what the older bosses refused to see: America wasn't Sicily. The rules were different here. Success required adaptation, collaboration, and above all, control. Where the mustache Petes clung to tradition, the young bloods embraced modernity. They wore sharp suits, drove fast cars, and dealt with Wall Street fixers as easily as bootleggers. They bribed cops and politicians with the same efficiency corporate lobbyists used. They spoke English, not Sicilian, and they thought in dollars, not vendettas. This generational divide was more than cultural, it was existential. The old bosses, like Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, viewed these young gangsters as reckless, disloyal, and dangerous. They didn't realize they were staring at their own replacements. Luciano's alliance grew stronger as the Prohibition years rolled on. Through Rothstein's mentorship, he and Lansky built a supply network that stretched from Canada to the Caribbean. Every bottle of bootleg whiskey, every crate of rum, was money in their pockets, and power in their hands. But their true genius wasn't just in moving product. It was in structure. Luciano began experimenting with organization. Instead of chaotic gangs, he imagined a system, departments, roles, hierarchy. He was designing a criminal corporation before the term even existed. His operations had layers: suppliers, distributors, enforcers, accountants, and money launderers. It was a legal enterprise with the discipline of a business empire. And at the top of that hierarchy he placed trust not in family but in ability. That was radical. The Sicilian bosses saw this as betrayal, but Luciano saw it as evolution. He believed loyalty based on fear or blood was fragile. Loyalty based on profit was unbreakable. Still, Luciano knew that ideas weren't enough. He needed influence. That meant power within the Italian-American underworld itself. For that, he'd have to navigate carefully between two powerful forces: Joe Masuria, the self-proclaimed boss of bosses, and Salvatore Maranzano, his ambitious rival from Castellamare del Golfo, Sicily. Luciano played both sides like a chess master. He worked under Masuria, pretending allegiance, while quietly building relationships with Maranzano's men. To the old dons he appeared respectful and obedient. But in private he and Lansky discussed a new kind of underworld, one without bosses, one governed by cooperation and business sense, not ancient vendettas. The tension between the old and the new was growing. The Mustache Pete's ruled by intimidation. Luciano and his crew ruled by innovation. Bugsy Siegel, meanwhile, expanded their reach through sheer charisma and brutality. He enforced Luciano's deals, silenced enemies, and cultivated connections in nightclubs and Hollywood circles. He was unpredictable but invaluable, a storm that Luciano learned to steer rather than stop. Their alliance was more than friendship. It was ideology. A quiet revolution was taking place in the underworld, not fought with bullets but with vision. Luciano and Lansky's network soon became indispensable. They could move liquor across states, fix political races, and manage money through legitimate fronts. They weren't just criminals, they were pioneers in organized corruption. But with success came attention. The old bosses noticed. And in their eyes these young men were heretics. The very idea of working with Jews or Irishmen was sacrilege. To them, Luciano's alliances weren't innovation, they were betrayal. By the late 1920s, tension was reaching a breaking point. The older generation was losing control, but they wouldn't go quietly. Behind smiles and toasts, knives were being sharpened. Luciano knew that the time was coming when he'd have to choose: loyalty to the past or loyalty to the future. And when that moment came, he didn't hesitate. He wasn't just building a crew, he was assembling the blueprint for a criminal empire that would outlive them all. The friendship between Luciano, Lansky, and Siegel was the foundation of something far greater than their wildest ambitions. Together, they would dismantle the old mafia and replace it with a modern syndicate that operated like a corporation, governed by rules, profit, and mutual benefit. They weren't just breaking the code of the underworld, they were rewriting it. As the 1930s approached, the city stood on the edge of change. The old guard was preparing for war. The young bloods were preparing for history. And at the center of it all, calm and patient, sat Lucky Luciano, the man who would soon take everything that was broken and turn it into an empire. By the early 1930s, the underworld of New York had become a city within the city, a hidden empire ruled by two kings, Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. Their names carried weight, their word meant life or death, and their feud would become one of the bloodiest conflicts in American organized crime. It was called the Castellamarese War, and it would mark the end of the old mafia, and the beginning of Lucky Luciano's new order. Joe Masuria was a brute disguised as a businessman. Born in Sicily and hardened in the streets of Little Italy, he ruled through fear, extortion, and the illusion of invincibility. He demanded loyalty like tribute. Every Italian gangster in New York was expected to pay him, serve him, and die for him if necessary. In his mind he wasn't just a boss, he was the boss of bosses. Masuria's empire stretched across Manhattan's rackets: gambling, loan sharking, bootlegging, and protection. But he had one fatal flaw: he was blind to the future. His methods were archaic, his temper unpredictable. He trusted no one but demanded obedience from everyone. On the other side stood Salvatore Maranzano, a rival from the Sicilian town of Castellamare del Golfo. Educated, cunning, and ambitious, Maranzano saw himself as a modern Julius Caesar, a man destined to bring order to the mafia through discipline and structure. But beneath his polished demeanor was the same old Sicilian arrogance that kept the Mafia chained to the past. Their war began in 1930. It started with whispers and ended with blood. Assassinations swept through New York. Cars exploded, bodies were found in alleys, and gunfire echoed through speakeasies. Gangsters switched sides, detectives were bought, and funerals became more common than weddings. No one knew who would survive, only that everyone had something to lose. Caught between these two aging titans was Lucky Luciano. To Masuria he was a loyal lieutenant, charming, reliable, and profitable. To Maranzano he was a potential ally, a bridge to the younger generation. To both he was useful. To Luciano they were both obsolete. He watched them with cold precision. He saw Masuria's paranoia grow with every loss, and Maranzano's ambition swell with every gain. Neither man saw the bigger picture. They were fighting for control of the streets, while Luciano was planning to control the system. He knew that the war couldn't be won through loyalty or honor, it could only be ended through strategy. And he was about to make the most dangerous move of his life. Luciano made a quiet, deliberate decision. He would play both sides, and outlive them both. He maintained his position under Masuria, giving him partial loyalty, partial truth, and full profit. At the same time he began communicating with Maranzano's people through intermediaries, testing the waters, feeling out a future alliance. Both bosses believed they were using him. In reality Luciano was using them. To the old Mafia, betrayal was unthinkable. To Luciano, betrayal was business. He had no interest in endless vendettas or emotional pride. He wanted efficiency, peace, profit, and power. But to achieve that the old world had to die. As the war dragged on, casualties mounted. The city's newspapers dubbed it, the Mafia slaughter. Civilians whispered of bodies dumped in the Hudson, of men vanishing overnight. The police were clueless, the politicians silent. But behind the chaos, Luciano was orchestrating something far more calculated. He approached Maranzano through trusted intermediaries and made a proposition: end this war. Help me remove Masuria and I'll help you take control. Maranzano agreed. And so, on April 15, 1931, a quiet afternoon at Coney Island, Joe, the boss Masuria, met his fate. Luciano arranged a meeting with him at a restaurant called Nuova Villa Tomorrow. They dined together, playing cards, sharing wine, the illusion of peace. Then, under the table, Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. Moments later, gunfire shattered the calm. Masuria slumped over the table, dead, his hand still clutching an ace of spades. The assassins, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, Vito Genovese, and Bugsy Siegel, were Luciano's men. The message was clear: the old boss was gone and the world was changing. Luciano returned moments after the hit, calmly surveyed the scene and left. No panic. No remorse. Just precision. In the weeks that followed, Maranzano took control of New York's underworld. He crowned himself Capo di Tutti Capi, boss of all bosses, declaring that every Mafia family would report to him. He reorganized the underworld into 5 families, a move that, ironically, would later serve Luciano's own vision perfectly. But while Maranzano's structure was smart, his ego was fatal. He treated Luciano as a subordinate, not an equal. He mocked his alliances with Jewish and Irish gangsters, calling them unclean. He lectured him on Sicilian honor, unaware that Luciano's patience was running thin. In Luciano's mind, the new order wasn't supposed to be a monarchy. It was supposed to be a syndicate. A system without kings, just businessmen managing crime like industry. Maranzano had simply replaced one crown with another. Luciano knew what had to happen. Just 5 months after Masuria's murder, Luciano struck again. This time the target was Maranzano himself. Maranzano had grown paranoid. He began hiring former police officers and hitmen to protect him, even planning to eliminate Luciano before Luciano could eliminate him. But he was too late. On September 10, 1931, a group of men posing as tax agents arrived at Maranzano's office in Manhattan. They carried briefcases, wore suits, and flashed badges. Once inside they pulled out guns and knives. Within minutes, Salvatore Maranzano was dead, stabbed and strangled on his own floor. The last boss of bosses had fallen. In the silence that followed, the Mafia held its breath. For the first time in history there was no single ruler, no tyrant, no bloody feud dividing the underworld. The city's gangs waited, wondering who would claim the throne. Luciano did not claim it. Instead he abolished it. He declared that there would be no more boss of bosses. From now on, all major Mafia families would operate independently but equally, governed by a collective council. a commission. It was a revolution. Luciano had dismantled centuries of Sicilian hierarchy and replaced it with something distinctly American, a democratic syndicate of organized crime. A boardroom instead of a battlefield. His betrayal of Masuria and Maranzano wasn't treachery, it was transformation. He had done what no gangster before him dared to do, turn the Mafia into an institution. The old guard was dead. The new world had begun. And at its center stood Lucky Luciano, calm, elegant, and visionary, the man who killed kings to build an empire. In the aftermath of the Castellamarese War, a strange quiet settled over New York. The streets, once echoing with gunfire and sirens, now hummed with the low rhythm of business. The Mafia had survived its own civil war, but it was not the same creature it once was. It had evolved. And at the heart of this transformation stood not just Lucky Luciano's new structure, but a deeper, invisible law, Omerta, the sacred code of silence. Omerta was not written, nor was it ever spoken aloud. It was inherited, absorbed through culture, through fear, through loyalty. It was the glue that held the Mafia together long before Luciano's reforms and long after they ended. It demanded silence above morality, loyalty above truth, and death before betrayal. For Luciano, this code was both armor and weapon. He understood that the Mafia couldn't survive in a world ruled by law and order unless its members believed in a law of their own. Omerta wasn't just about keeping secrets, it was about building a culture of absolute obedience, where men didn't just fear the police, they feared dishonor. Where a whisper could mean death and silence could mean power. In Sicily, Omerta had been born out of necessity. It grew in the cracks of oppression, a way for peasants and outlaws to survive under corrupt rulers. To keep one's mouth shut was to live another day. To speak to outsiders, especially the police, was to commit the ultimate sin. But in America, Luciano reshaped Omerta into something larger. It became not just a code of silence but the foundation of an empire. Every member of the Mafia, from lowly soldier to powerful don, took an oath that bound them for life. Blood was spilled, a saint's image burned, and a promise was made: if I betray my friends, may my soul burn like this saint. This ritual, ancient and terrifying, created a bond stronger than any legal contract. The organization didn't exist on paper. There were no signatures, no records. Only men bound by fear, loyalty, and greed, by the belief that betrayal was worse than death. Luciano understood the psychological genius of Omerta. He didn't invent it, he perfected it. He realized that men could be controlled not by force alone, but by identity. If a man believed that breaking Omerta meant betraying who he was, then Luciano didn't need to threaten him. The code would do it for him. Inside Luciano's new world, loyalty became the highest currency. The rules were clear. Never speak to law enforcement. Never betray another member. Never involve outsiders in Mafia business. And above all, respect the hierarchy. These weren't just rules, they were a religion. Luciano's meetings often felt more like sermons than strategy sessions. He would talk about respect, family, the life. His words carried weight not because of charisma alone, but because they gave criminals a sense of purpose. Under him, the Mafia wasn't just a gang, it was an institution of belonging. That was Luciano's genius. He replaced chaos with culture, violence with order, fear with faith, and Omerta was the Bible. But the code also carried a darker side, one that slowly began to consume those who lived by it. To maintain the illusion of unity, dissent had to be erased. Suspicion was a death sentence. If a man was even rumored to be talking to the police, he vanished. If someone disrespected a higher-up, they were silenced, sometimes by their own friends. Luciano never hesitated to enforce these laws. He didn't enjoy bloodshed, but he understood its purpose. Each execution was not just punishment, it was education. It reminded everyone what the code meant. It was this balance, discipline and fear, that kept the organization stable. In a city full of corruption, the Mafia under Luciano's leadership operated with more structure than most corporations. Orders flowed downward, money flowed upward. Everyone had a place and everyone had a price. Even the police, judges, and politicians learned to respect the code, not because they believed in it but because they feared what happened when they challenged it. Yet behind this veil of loyalty, there was always an undercurrent of paranoia. Luciano's closest associates, men like Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and Meyer Lansky, understood the value of silence. But they also understood ambition. And ambition in the Mafia was a quiet kind of violence. Omerta kept them united in purpose but divided in trust. No one could ever be completely sure who was loyal and who was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. For Luciano it was a delicate balance, trust enough to function, fear enough to control. He often said, "You can't run a business if you don't know when to be human and when to be a wolf." That duality became his hallmark. He rewarded loyalty lavishly, money, protection, respect. But betrayal, even suspected betrayal, was answered with surgical ruthlessness. The irony of Omerta was that while it created unity, it also built an invisible prison. Men couldn't leave the life even if they wanted to. To walk away was to break the code. To talk was to die. Families of gangsters learned this the hard way. Wives never asked questions, sons learned to lie early, and daughters grew up knowing silence was safety. In neighborhoods like Little Italy and East Harlem, the code extended beyond the mafia itself. Locals who saw crimes looked the other way. Shopkeepers paid protection without complaint. Even priests blessed men who had blood on their hands, because to speak against them was unthinkable. Luciano had effectively embedded the mafia's morality into the city's culture. Omerta had crossed from being a criminal code to being a social one. Yet, the very code that protected Luciano's empire would also become its Achilles heel. As decades passed, Omerta would clash with a new kind of enemy, not the rival gangsters of the old days, but law enforcement armed with wiretaps, surveillance and plea bargains. When the first mafia men began breaking the code in the 1950s and 60s, it sent shockwaves through the underworld. Luciano, watching from exile in Italy years later, would call it the death of honor. But in the early 1930s, when his empire was young and thriving, Omerta was still sacred. It was his invisible fortress, the unseen power that kept his empire intact. In a city of noise, Luciano ruled through silence. And that silence, for a time, made him untouchable. Omerta was not merely a rule of the mafia. Under Lucky Luciano, it became the soul of organized crime, a religion of loyalty, a prison of fear, and the heartbeat of an empire that would shape the next century. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano stood at the pinnacle of organized crime. He had transformed chaos into order, turned gang wars into business meetings, and redefined what it meant to be a gangster in America. Yet even as his empire expanded, Luciano understood an eternal truth: power never exists in isolation. It feeds on alliances and it's threatened by enemies. In the world he built, both could change places overnight. Luciano's rise had been born from betrayal, but it was sustained by loyalty, or at least the appearance of it. Around him stood a constellation of men who would define the mafia's golden age: Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Albert Anastasia, and Dutch Schultz. Together, they formed a network that blurred the lines between crime and capitalism. Each of them represented a piece of Luciano's vision. Each of them also carried the potential to destroy it. Vito Genovese was Luciano's shadow, ruthless, efficient, and utterly cold. Where Luciano was a visionary, Genovese was a predator. He had helped orchestrate Masuria's murder and stood beside Luciano during the restructuring of the mafia, but his ambitions were too large to stay hidden. He didn't dream of partnership. He dreamed of succession. Frank Costello, on the other hand, was the diplomat. Polished, calculating, and politically connected, he understood power in a different way. He was the bridge between the underworld and the upper world, a man who could sit at a table with senators and mobsters in the same night, making both feel like equals. Then there was Meyer Lansky, Luciano's most trusted non-Italian ally. A Jewish kid from Belarus who grew up in the same streets, Lansky shared Luciano's intellect and his business sensibilities. Together they thought beyond street corners and territories. They envisioned a corporate crime syndicate. To Luciano, Lansky wasn't just a partner. He was proof that the mafia could evolve beyond its Sicilian roots. "It's not about blood," Luciano once said. "It's about brains." Bugsy Siegel was the fire to Lansky's ice, charismatic, volatile, and fearless. He had a taste for luxury and a talent for violence. Siegel was the embodiment of the new generation, reckless but visionary, charming but lethal. And then there was Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner. Cold, methodical, and terrifying, Anastasia commanded the most fearsome enforcement arm of the organization, Murder Incorporated. If the mafia was a business, Anastasia was its security division, ensuring silence, order, and obedience through controlled terror. Together, these men turned Luciano's empire into something unprecedented: a national syndicate. The commission, Luciano's brainchild, became the formal structure of this new order. It was the mafia's board of directors, a governing council of the most powerful families across the country. Decisions on territory, business disputes, and internal justice were made collectively, reducing the need for open warfare. Each family, from New York to Chicago to Cleveland, had representation. The idea was revolutionary, a democracy of criminals. Luciano believed this would prevent the bloodshed that had nearly destroyed the Mafia a few years earlier. But democracy has its weaknesses. And in the shadows of the commission, ambition began to stir. The first serious challenge came from within. Dutch Schultz, a brash Jewish gangster from the Bronx, had built a fortune in bootlegging and numbers rackets. He was powerful, unpredictable, and increasingly erratic. When federal prosecutors, led by Thomas E. Dewey, began targeting organized crime, Schultz became obsessed. He demanded permission from the commission to assassinate Dewey, who was threatening to dismantle their operations. Luciano refused. He knew that killing a high-profile prosecutor would unleash the full wrath of the federal government on the underworld. Schultz didn't care. He saw it as a matter of survival, even revenge. When Schultz defied orders and began planning Dewey's murder on his own, Luciano made a decision that tested the very code of omerta. He sanctioned the killing of a man inside his own syndicate. In October 1935, Dutch Schultz was gunned down in a Newark restaurant. He lived for almost a day, delirious and ranting in his hospital bed before dying, his empire divided, his name erased. To outsiders it looked like another gang hit. To insiders it was a message. No one, not even allies, could challenge the order Luciano built. But while Luciano's command was absolute, his enemies were evolving too. Law enforcement was learning. Thomas Dewey, the same prosecutor Schultz had wanted dead, turned his attention toward Luciano himself. Unlike previous officials, Dewey didn't rely on raids or hearsay. He used evidence, witnesses, and public outrage. He understood that Luciano wasn't just another mob boss. He was the face of an entire criminal system. Meanwhile, in the underworld, Vito Genovese began weaving his own web of intrigue. When Luciano was forced to flee temporarily due to law enforcement heat, Genovese tried to consolidate power in his absence. He believed that Luciano's empire should belong to him, that he, not Lucky, was destined to be the true boss. Luciano, ever the strategist, knew how to play the long game. He allowed Genovese to overreach, to make enemies, to show his hand. And when the time was right, Luciano reminded everyone that even in absence, he was still in control. He didn't rule through constant violence. He ruled through perception. In the Mafia, the illusion of power was often more important than power itself. Still, the cracks were forming. The alliances that made the syndicate strong were also its greatest vulnerability. Trust among killers, after all, is always temporary. Lansky and Siegel began focusing on Las Vegas, chasing dreams of casino empires. Costello grew closer to politicians than gangsters. Genovese seethed quietly, waiting for Luciano's fall. And beyond them all, the world itself was changing. Prohibition, the golden goose of organized crime, had ended. The profits from bootlegging, which had built Luciano's fortune, were gone. The Mafia had to evolve again, moving deeper into gambling, labor racketeering, and narcotics. Each shift brought new dangers. Each expansion brought new enemies, both inside and outside. In public, Luciano remained calm, untouchable, and composed, the archetype of the modern gangster. But privately he knew the truth. Power in his world was never stable. It was a dance on the edge of a knife. Every ally was a potential traitor. Every friend a future rival. He once told Meyer Lansky, half in jest, half in warning, "You can't trust a man who's not afraid to die, and you can't control one who's got nothing left to lose." That line, like much of Luciano's philosophy, was less about fear and more about insight. He didn't just build a criminal organization, he studied human nature. He understood greed, ambition, loyalty, and fear better than most psychologists. And it was that understanding, that psychological insight, that allowed him to rule longer than any man before him. But as history would show, even Lucky Luciano couldn't stay lucky forever. Because in the world he created, the line between ally and enemy was razor thin, and sooner or later, even the sharpest mind can be cut by its own blade. Luciano's world was one of balance, a network of loyalty and treachery, held together by fear and vision. His allies gave him power. His enemies gave him purpose. And both, in the end, would define his downfall. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano had achieved what no man before him had: peace among gangsters. The gunfire that once rattled through Manhattan streets had gone silent. The underworld now operated like a boardroom, with rules, structure, and a hierarchy so efficient that even Wall Street would envy it. But beneath that calm exterior, another kind of war was brewing, one Luciano couldn't control. It wasn't fought in alleys or bars. It was fought in courtrooms, backrooms, and headlines. It was a war between the Mafia and the modern American state. And it would be the first time Luciano realized that no matter how smart or powerful you are, you can't outwit history forever. The Great Depression had reshaped America. Jobs were scarce, desperation was currency, and crime became a business for survival. To the average New Yorker, the Mafia wasn't an abstract evil, it was a shadow government that got things done. Luciano, in particular, cultivated this image carefully. He wasn't seen as a brutal killer but as a businessman, suave, courteous, and almost civic-minded. He invested in nightclubs, helped local politicians secure votes, and even funded charities. In some circles he was spoken of with a strange respect, as if he were a kind of dark Robin Hood of the underworld. But the more Luciano legitimized crime, the more he attracted attention, not from rivals but from reformers. And none was more determined than Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was everything Luciano wasn't: clean-cut, idealistic, and relentless. He was a federal prosecutor with one mission: to destroy organized crime in New York. He didn't believe in backroom deals or political favors. He believed in evidence. To Dewey, Luciano wasn't a businessman. He was a parasite feeding on America's weakest: the gamblers, the workers, the women forced into prostitution. And it was that last business, prostitution, that would become Luciano's undoing. For years, Luciano had kept his hands clean of the lower trades. Prostitution was chaotic, dirty, and dangerous. But through his lieutenants, especially Charlie the Bug Workman and Vito Genovese, Luciano's syndicate still collected protection money from hundreds of brothels across the city. It was a small part of his empire, but it was the thread that Dewey would pull until the entire tapestry unraveled. Using undercover officers, Dewey's team began raiding brothels and interrogating madams and prostitutes. At first they said nothing. The code of omerta extended even to those at the bottom of the underworld. But Dewey didn't rely on intimidation. He relied on persuasion. He promised protection, anonymity, even a chance at a new life. And slowly the walls of silence began to crack. One woman in particular, Cokie Flo Brown, a drug-addicted madam, became the unlikely key witness. Her testimony linked Luciano's lieutenants directly to the city's prostitution network, and from there to Luciano himself. Dewey now had a trail. Luciano, sensing the pressure, remained outwardly calm. He continued his routine: expensive suits, fine restaurants, late-night meetings at the Waldorf Astoria. But privately he knew the game had changed. He had always relied on corruption to shield him. Police officers on payroll, judges in pocket, politicians who owed him favors. Yet Dewey was incorruptible. And worse, he was popular. The public loved the young prosecutor who dared to take on the Mafia. Newspapers hailed him as a hero. Each new arrest, each headline, added to his myth. Luciano had built his empire in the shadows. Dewey was dragging it into the light. Inside the commission, tension grew. Some of Luciano's associates urged him to flee, to Cuba or even back to Italy. Others believed Dewey's case would collapse without hard evidence. Luciano himself refused to run. To flee would be to admit guilt and to show weakness, a death sentence in the underworld. Instead he doubled down. He paid off journalists, funded smear campaigns, and even sent intermediaries to negotiate with Dewey's team. None of it worked. The net was closing in. In April 1936, Thomas Dewey issued a warrant for Luciano's arrest on 91 counts of compulsory prostitution. For the first time, the untouchable man was on the run. Luciano fled New York, moving through upstate towns and safe houses, trying to outmaneuver federal agents. But this wasn't the 1920s anymore. The Mafia's invisibility was fading. Every hotel clerk, every local cop had seen his face in the papers. He was finally caught in Hot Springs, Arkansas, a resort town famous for its corruption and criminal visitors. Local authorities, long friendly to gangsters, tried to protect him. But Dewey was relentless. Federal marshals stormed in, seized Luciano, and dragged him back to New York in handcuffs. The news made front-page headlines across America. Lucky Luciano captured. The myth had been broken. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational in history. Dewey presented a parade of witnesses, brothel madams, prostitutes, and informants, all pointing to Luciano as the mastermind behind a citywide prostitution ring. Luciano denied everything. He insisted he had nothing to do with it, that the women were lying for money or protection. And in truth, there was little hard evidence linking him directly to the crime. But Dewey didn't need proof beyond reasonable doubt. He had something stronger: public sentiment. The courtroom was packed with reporters. The jury watched a polished, articulate gangster facing down a clean-cut crusader. It wasn't just a trial, it was a morality play. And in that theater, perception mattered more than truth. Meanwhile, the hidden war within the Mafia intensified. With Luciano distracted, rivals like Vito Genovese saw opportunity. He began consolidating influence, whispering that Luciano's fall proved his recklessness. Others, like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, stayed loyal, but even they understood that the empire was fracturing. The commission, which had once been Luciano's crowning achievement, now functioned as a battlefield of quiet power plays. Luciano's absence created a vacuum, and in the underworld, a vacuum never lasts long. When the verdict finally came, it was devastating. Luciano was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. It was a seismic moment, not just for him but for the Mafia itself. For the first time in American history, the head of a national crime syndicate had been brought down not by bullets, but by bureaucracy. As Luciano was led away in shackles, he smiled faintly for the cameras. It was the same smile he wore in his youth, confident, enigmatic, unbroken. But inside he knew the truth, the hidden war was over. And for the first time in his life, Lucky Luciano had lost. This wasn't the kind of war he knew how to fight. No guns, no loyalty, no rules. It was fought with subpoenas and confessions, waged in the open for the world to see. The age of silence was ending. The age of exposure had begun. When the courtroom doors finally closed behind him in 1936, Charles Lucky Luciano, the man who once ruled New York's criminal underworld with an iron hand and a businessman's calm, was no longer the king of the Mafia. He was now inmate number 92168 in a state penitentiary. For a man who had once dined in tuxedos at the Waldorf Astoria, controlled police precincts with envelopes of cash, and dictated the fate of gangsters from coast to coast, the clang of a prison cell was the sound of a new kind of war, one he couldn't manipulate, bribe, or outthink. The fall of Lucky Luciano didn't happen overnight. It was a slow collapse, a dismantling of the myth he had built, piece by piece, until all that remained was the man beneath the legend. In the days following his conviction, newspapers across America celebrated the verdict as a victory for law and morality. "The empire of vice has fallen," one headline proclaimed. Thomas Dewey was hailed as a hero, the young prosecutor who had done what no one else dared to do, take down the most powerful mobster in America. Politicians, clergy, and social reformers praised him as a symbol of hope against corruption. But inside the Mafia, the mood was far more complicated. To some, Luciano's fall was a tragedy, the unjust imprisonment of a man who had brought order and prosperity to the underworld. To others, it was opportunity, the removal of a king who had ruled too long. The commission, now led by a loose coalition of family heads, pretended to remain loyal to him. They sent money to his lawyers, paid for appeals, and swore that business would continue in his name. But the truth was far darker. His empire was already being carved up. From his cell at Clinton Correctional Facility, Luciano received carefully worded letters from his old allies, coded messages wrapped in friendship. Frank Costello, ever the politician, assured him that he was keeping the business stable, that the unions and gambling rackets were running smoothly. Vito Genovese, meanwhile, sent his respect and support, words that dripped with false sincerity. In reality, Genovese was already maneuvering to seize power. He began courting allies within the commission, whispering that Luciano's methods had grown reckless, that the syndicate needed new leadership. It was the oldest Mafia story in the book. When the king falls, the jackals come out. Prison life was its own kind of hell for Luciano. He was kept under tight security, isolated from most other inmates, and subjected to near-constant scrutiny. The guards saw him as a trophy, a symbol of state triumph. They treated him with a mix of awe and contempt. Some sought his respect, others wanted to break him. But Luciano refused to be broken. He adapted quickly, establishing quiet authority even behind bars. Through favors, charisma, and calculated generosity, he won the loyalty of guards and inmates alike. Within months, he had turned his cell block into a miniature version of the world he once ruled. Cigarettes became currency. Guards smuggled messages. And slowly, Luciano began rebuilding control, not of his empire but of his image. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the world was changing. The Mafia Luciano had left behind was expanding westward, into Las Vegas, Havana, and even Hollywood. His old friend Meyer Lansky had started investing in casinos, turning gambling from a street racket into a global business. Bugsy Siegel was leading construction of the Flamingo Hotel in the Nevada desert, dreaming of a criminal empire built on luxury and illusion. It was everything Luciano had envisioned: crime turned into commerce, vice turned into enterprise. But now it was happening without him. He was becoming a ghost in his own creation, a myth still feared but no longer felt. The psychological toll began to show. Luciano, who once commanded thousands, now spent his days in a concrete box, replaying memories of deals and betrayals like a man reading his own obituary. He wrote letters obsessively, to Lansky, to Costello, even to old friends from the Lower East Side, not to beg but to remain remembered. He had built his empire on the belief that fear could outlast mortality. But in prison he discovered the cruel truth: fear fades when presence disappears. Yet even then he refused to accept defeat. He began studying law, working on appeals and plotting quietly, not for revenge but for relevance. He still believed he could find a way back. In 1940, Vito Genovese fled the country after being charged with murder, running to Italy under the pretense of exile. It was a temporary victory for Luciano. Frank Costello, now the acting boss of the family, took over much of Luciano's operations, keeping profits flowing through gambling and unions. Costello remained loyal, at least outwardly. He visited Luciano in prison when possible, smuggled updates and kept his name alive in meetings. But even he knew that power was shifting. The underworld no longer needed a single ruler. The syndicate Luciano had built had become self-sustaining, an institution that operated without him. And that was perhaps the cruelest irony of all. He had dreamed of creating a system that could survive beyond its leaders. Now that dream had come true, and it had erased him in the process. As the 1940s dawned, America moved toward war, and the world Luciano once dominated began to blur into history. But fate, unpredictable as ever, was not done with him yet. When the United States entered World War II, the government faced a crisis. German submarines were destroying cargo ships along the East Coast, and fears of sabotage spread through New York's ports. The docks, controlled by unions deeply connected to the Mafia, became a matter of national security. And in an extraordinary twist of irony, the same government that had imprisoned Lucky Luciano now realized it might need him. Officials from the Office of Naval Intelligence reached out through intermediaries. They wanted to use Luciano's influence to secure the docks, to ensure loyalty, safety, and information. The man who had been condemned as the face of organized vice was suddenly being asked to help protect the nation. It was the ultimate paradox, and the beginning of an unexpected redemption arc. Inside his cell, Luciano understood what few men ever do, that even from prison power is perception. He might have been physically confined, but as long as his name inspired loyalty, as long as politicians and soldiers whispered it in secret, he wasn't finished. And so, quietly, the seeds of his comeback were planted, not in the streets of New York, but in the war rooms of Washington. The year was 1936, and the corridors of the New York Criminal Courts building were buzzing with anticipation. Reporters jostled for space, cameras flashed, and the name Lucky Luciano dominated headlines across the country. For years, the man had been untouchable, a phantom presence behind every racket, every payoff, every whispered threat. Now, at last, he was being dragged into the light. Thomas E. Dewey, the relentless special prosecutor, had built his case not on the typical street-level arrests but on the word of those who had once served Luciano directly. His method was novel, even revolutionary for its time. Instead of chasing the gunman, Dewey had gone after the system, the structure of vice, the invisible network of pimps, madams and mob enforcers that fed into the city's underworld economy. And at the top of that system, he argued, stood one man. Dewey's voice in the courtroom was sharp and clinical, his evidence organized like a surgeon's scalpel. He painted Luciano not as a thug but as a CEO of crime, orchestrating an empire of prostitution that spanned Manhattan. Witnesses described coded messages, envelopes of cash, and a chain of command that always ended with, "Charlie Lucky." Luciano sat quietly through much of it, his expression unreadable. He was impeccably dressed, confident, even charming at times, as if the entire trial were just another business meeting. But behind his calm eyes, the calculation never stopped. Every word spoken against him was being measured, stored, and filed away for later use. The star witness was a woman named Cokie Flo Brown, a former madam who had once operated under the Mafia's protection. Her testimony was explosive. She claimed that Luciano's men collected weekly insurance payments from brothels and that Lucky himself attended meetings where quotas and punishments were discussed. To the press, she was sensational, the fallen woman who dared to stand up to the king of vice. To Luciano, she was a traitor. And in the world he came from, traitors never survived long. But the courtroom was not the streets of New York. Here the rules were different. Dewey's strategy was psychological as much as legal. He turned Luciano's own reputation against him, painting him as a man who ruled through fear so absolute that no one dared disobey. When the jury saw Luciano's calm, his half-smile as witnesses wept on the stand, it didn't project innocence. It projected power, and that, more than any evidence, sealed his fate. Behind the scenes, Luciano's defense team worked furiously. His lawyers argued that the case was built on lies and coerced testimony, that Dewey was simply using Luciano's fame to advance his own political career. And there was truth in that. Dewey's rise was fueled by this very prosecution. But for once, public sentiment wasn't with the mobster. The Great Depression had left the city angry and hungry. Corruption, crime, and poverty had become symbols of everything that was wrong with the system. Luciano wasn't seen as a businessman anymore. He was the face of rot, the proof that crime had become too powerful, too sophisticated, too untouchable. When the jury went into deliberation, Luciano remained confident. He had escaped worse before. Bribes had worked miracles in the past, witnesses had disappeared, cases had collapsed. But this time something was different. The old ways of influence didn't work against a man like Dewey. Dewey had built his career on defying those pressures, and the city was watching. After 9 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreman stood, eyes fixed on Luciano, and read the verdict. Guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The words seemed to echo in slow motion. Luciano didn't flinch. He simply nodded, whispered something to his attorney, and adjusted his tie. But the photographers caught the brief tightening of his jaw, the single fleeting crack in the armor. Judge Philip L. McCook's sentence was severe, almost theatrical, 30 to 50 years in state prison. It was one of the harshest penalties ever handed down for that crime in U.S. history. Dewey's message was clear: the age of untouchable gangsters was over. The courtroom erupted in a flurry of shouts, flashes, and scribbling pens. Dewey was hailed a national hero that night, while Luciano was led away in handcuffs, head high, expression unreadable. Outside, the city reacted with a mixture of awe and disbelief. For decades, men like Luciano had been mythologized, larger-than-life figures who commanded both fear and respect. The idea that one of them could be beaten by the system felt almost impossible. In the underworld there was silence. Luciano's allies moved quickly, assuring the commission that operations would continue, that Lucky's conviction didn't mean collapse. But in private, power brokers began redrawing lines, staking claims, and preparing for succession. Even Meyer Lansky, Luciano's closest friend, knew that things had changed forever. The foundation of their empire, built on control and invisibility, had been exposed to the harsh light of law and public morality. As Luciano was transported to Clinton Correctional Facility, the irony was inescapable. He had once prided himself on creating a mafia that could outthink the law, a structure immune to prosecution. Yet here he was, a victim not of violence or betrayal, but of a system that had finally learned how to fight men like him. His enemies hadn't killed him, justice had outsmarted him. Still, even as the prison gates closed behind him, Luciano refused to accept that it was over. In his mind he remained the boss, not of the streets but of himself. The sentence was long, but so was his patience. He had built an empire once. He could rebuild influence again, even from the inside. In the months that followed, Dewey capitalized on his victory. He rode the wave of publicity straight into politics, eventually becoming governor of New York. His name became synonymous with integrity and courage. Luciano, meanwhile, became the cautionary tale, the fall of a king. Newspapers called him the Vice Tsar, a man undone by his own ambition. But among those who truly understood power, there was a different interpretation. Lucky Luciano hadn't been defeated by morality, he had been defeated by visibility. The modern world no longer allowed shadows that big. The trial of Lucky Luciano wasn't just the story of one man's downfall, it was the symbolic death of an era. It marked the end of the flamboyant gangster age, of open rackets, flashy cars, and public corruption, and the birth of a new kind of underworld, quieter, more corporate, more elusive. And in that sense, even from behind bars, Luciano's influence endured. The empire he created would evolve, adapt, and survive, but the man himself would spend the next decade wrestling with a haunting realization that in the battle between crime and justice, sometimes the law doesn't need to kill you to destroy your legacy, it only needs to confine your myth. Behind the cold stone walls of Clinton Correctional Facility, Lucky Luciano's empire should have ended. By every measure of the law, it had ended. The man who once dined with mayors and dictated underworld policy was now just another inmate, stripped of wealth, freedom, and command. But in the logic of power, especially the kind born in the Mafia's bloodstream, control is not a matter of place. It's a matter of presence. And Lucky Luciano's presence, even in chains, was too large to contain. Clinton was a fortress of discipline, designed to crush ego and individuality. But Luciano had never been a man who played by someone else's rules. Within weeks, he began reshaping his surroundings, bending the prison hierarchy to his advantage. He observed first, watching who had influence among inmates, who could be bought, who could be broken. Then came the favors: cigarettes, extra food, small luxuries that only Luciano seemed able to obtain. Soon, guards were greeting him with a quiet nod of respect. Prisoners deferred to him in the yard. He was no longer inmate 92168, he was still Charlie Lucky. The warden, aware of Luciano's notoriety, tried to keep him isolated. Yet even under constant surveillance, information flowed. Messages slipped through coded letters, smuggled in books, and whispered through visiting lawyers. Somehow, from a concrete cell in upstate New York, Lucky Luciano continued to steer pieces of his criminal machine, not through orders but through influence. His old allies, particularly Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, understood the language. They didn't need instructions. They needed only to know that Luciano was watching. Outside the prison walls, the Mafia was changing shape. The Commission, Luciano's creation, continued to govern, now acting as a board of directors for organized crime across America. The families respected its structure, but its spirit was fading. Without Luciano's steady hand, old rivalries simmered again. Frank Costello became the diplomat of the syndicate, maintaining peace and political ties. But Vito Genovese, ever ambitious, was already scheming from Italy, waiting for the moment to reclaim control. Even behind bars, Luciano could sense it. Through coded exchanges and reports smuggled via attorneys, he learned of shifting loyalties, of Genovese's whispers. It infuriated him, not because he feared losing power but because he knew what it meant: chaos. The empire he had built to end the chaos was beginning to crack. Still, he refused to act in desperation. He had always been patient, calculating. If the world was going to change, he would wait until it needed him again. And history, as it often did, was already setting the stage. As the 1940s dawned, the world was engulfed in war. The United States had entered World War II, and the government was facing a new kind of fear: sabotage on its own soil. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships, and rumors spread that Axis agents had infiltrated the New York docks. The docks, however, were Mafia territory. The longshoremen's unions, the lifeblood of wartime logistics, were under the quiet control of Frank Costello's men. For federal agents, this presented an uncomfortable truth: to secure the ports, they needed cooperation from organized crime. That's when Lucky Luciano's name resurfaced, not in the newspapers but in the corridors of naval intelligence. The idea was controversial, even unthinkable. But desperate times breed strange alliances. The Office of Naval Intelligence reached out discreetly, through intermediaries who had connections to both the underworld and the government. They wanted a deal, help securing the docks in exchange for leniency. And there was only one man who could make that deal stick. Inside Clinton, Luciano listened as his lawyer presented the offer. The details were vague, the risks enormous. Yet for Luciano, the opportunity was electrifying. He could turn disgrace into relevance, criminal guilt into patriotic service. "Tell them," he reportedly said, "I'll make sure not a single enemy touches the docks. But I want my people protected." Operation Underworld, as it came to be called, was born in secrecy. Through intermediaries like Meyer Lansky and Albert Anastasia, the notorious Lord High Executioner of Murder Incorporated, Luciano facilitated an understanding between U.S. naval authorities and the Mafia-controlled unions. Dockworkers cooperated, suspicious activity disappeared, and the fear of sabotage faded. Luciano had done the impossible. From behind prison bars, he made himself useful to the United States government. The irony was intoxicating. The same man condemned as the Vice Czar of New York had now become an asset in the fight against fascism. In the public eye, nothing was known. But within certain circles of power, Luciano's name began to regain its mystique, not as a gangster but as a necessary evil. His influence had proven too valuable to erase. Even his enemies had to admit it. The man understood control better than anyone alive. As the war ended, rumors spread that his cooperation had saved lives, prevented strikes, and maintained order on the critical East Coast shipping lines. Whether true or exaggerated, it gave the authorities political cover to reconsider his case. Thomas Dewey, now governor of New York, was approached quietly with a proposal: commute Luciano's sentence in recognition of his wartime assistance. For Dewey it was a dilemma. Releasing the man he had built his reputation on convicting could be political suicide. But the evidence of cooperation, and the quiet pressure from intelligence officials, was hard to ignore. In 1946, after 10 years behind bars, Dewey signed the commutation order. The condition was clear: Luciano would be deported to Italy, permanently barred from returning to the United States. And just like that, the man who had once ruled New York's criminal underworld walked out of prison. Older, thinner, but still exuding that calm, magnetic power that had always made men follow him. The guards who watched him leave understood they were witnessing something rare, not a fall but a rebirth. Luciano had gone to prison as a symbol of criminal excess, but he emerged as something far more complex. A myth that even the law had been forced to bargain with. In the shadows of his confinement, he had proven the ultimate truth of his philosophy, that real power isn't about fear or violence. It's about necessity. As he stepped onto the ship bound for Naples, Lucky Luciano wasn't thinking of defeat. He was thinking of opportunity. Prison hadn't broken him. It had refined him. The world still needed Lucky Luciano, only now it would be on his terms. And as the skyline of New York faded behind him, he smiled quietly to himself. They thought they'd buried him. In reality, they had just taught him how to rule from the grave. When Lucky Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946, he stepped off the ship like a man detached from time, an emperor without a throne. The New York skyline that had once symbolized his power was now a distant memory. America, the land that had made him and then destroyed him, was closed to him forever. Naples, with its sunlit streets and echoes of old Sicily, became both sanctuary and prison. To the locals he was a mysterious figure, polite, reserved, a man who tipped generously but spoke little about his past. Yet behind that quiet exterior, Luciano was restless. He still had connections. Whispers from Havana, messages from New York, shipments that moved across oceans. Even in exile, he was a shadow at the edge of every major deal. But power has a half-life. The men he once commanded grew bold in his absence. New bosses rose, unpredictable, violent, careless. The golden age of organized discipline gave way to greed and chaos. Luciano watched from afar as the empire he'd built with precision began to fracture. He knew it was inevitable. No empire, legal or criminal, lasts forever. In the early 1950s, Luciano became involved with drug trafficking operations stretching from Sicily to the United States. Though he denied direct involvement, American authorities blamed him for the heroin routes that flooded New York. His name still carried weight, a name both revered and cursed. By the 1960s he was an old man haunted by ghosts. He often said, "Everything I built came back to me but smaller." His life became a quiet routine. Evenings in cafes, walks along the waterfront, endless hours replaying the choices that had defined him. Then, on January 26, 1962, after a meeting with a film producer about telling his life story, Lucky Luciano collapsed at Naples airport. His heart simply stopped. In that instant, the architect of America's criminal empire was gone. No gunfire. No sirens. Just silence. He was buried in St. John's Cemetery, Queens, the same soil he once ruled. Though far from his empire in life, in death he returned to it, a symbol of ambition, control, and the eternal price of power. His exile had ended, but his legend had only just begun. Lucky Luciano's death in Naples wasn't an end, it was the closing of a myth. The newspapers called him the father of organized crime, but history would remember him as something more complex. The man who turned chaos into a system. He built an empire not just through violence but through vision. The commission he created changed the Mafia forever, transforming it from a bloody street network into a boardroom of power. For the first time, crime had structure, hierarchy, and diplomacy. Luciano had made the underworld modern. But his real genius wasn't organization, it was psychology. He ruled not by fear but by understanding desire. He gave men purpose, profit, and belonging, and in return their loyalty became his armor. He understood that control comes not from domination but from dependency. His legacy lives far beyond the Mafia. Governments, corporations, and even global cartels would later mirror his methods. Decentralized control, silent leadership, and shared profit. The same principles that made him feared also made him immortal. Yet the paradox of Lucky Luciano is this. He brought order to lawlessness but left behind a system built on exploitation. He was both the builder and the destroyer of his own creation. In the end, Luciano's story is not about crime, it's about power. And the world still follows the blueprint he left behind. Conclusion, almost equals 300 words. In the quiet after the storm, Luciano's shadow still lingers, stretching from the streets of Manhattan to the boardrooms of power. He didn't invent the Mafia, he redesigned it, reshaped it, and in the process redefined the meaning of control. His life was the inverted American dream, a rise from nothing to power without morality as the cost of entry. He proved that ambition, intelligence, and ruthlessness could build an empire faster than honesty ever could. Luciano's greatest creation wasn't an organization, it was an idea, that power, when organized, can survive any downfall. Today his name exists somewhere between myth and memory. Movies romanticize him, historians analyze him, and the world quietly imitates him. His rules of loyalty, silence, and strategy still echo through every structure built on control. In the end, Lucky Luciano was neither hero nor villain. He was the architect of the gray zone, the space where ambition meets corruption, where order is born from chaos. He didn't just rewrite the Mafia's code. He rewrote the world's understanding of power itself. Fade to black. When Lucky Luciano died in Naples, the headlines called him the father of organized crime, but his true legacy ran much deeper. He didn't invent the Mafia, he re-engineered it. Through his creation of the Commission, he transformed scattered street gangs into a coordinated empire where profit replaced vendetta and negotiation replaced bloodshed. Luciano saw the underworld as a corporation waiting to be organized. Every racket had a department, every boss a board seat. Crime became business, efficient, scalable, and quietly civilized. That vision outlived him, shaping the way syndicates and even corporations manage power today. His real mastery, though, was psychological. He ruled not through terror but through understanding. Loyalty, he knew, came from opportunity, not fear. His charisma made killers act like shareholders, invested in his success because it meant their own survival. Yet his empire carried a curse. It thrived on human weakness. The same system that brought order to chaos also deepened exploitation and vice. Luciano's brilliance created an empire that could run without him, but one that could never escape its corruption. In the end, Lucky Luciano's name became a symbol of ambition without morality, of genius without redemption. His methods built the blueprint of modern power, decentralized, disciplined, and enduring. He didn't just lead a generation of gangsters, he taught the world how control truly works. Conclusion is almost equal to 300 words. As the final act fades, the story of Lucky Luciano feels less like a crime saga and more like a mirror held up to the world. He rose from the slums of the Lower East Side to command an invisible empire, proving that structure can grow from chaos, even if it's born in the shadows. Luciano's empire may have dissolved, but his logic survived. Governments, corporations, and syndicates all echo his philosophy. Control the system and you control everything. His reign ended, yet his ideas became timeless, that power thrives best when it's unseen. He was both product and prophet of the American dream, the immigrant who mastered its rules only to twist them. In him we see the paradox of ambition. The same qualities that build greatness also invite ruin. Today his image lingers in film reels and whispered legends. The calm face behind the myth, the strategist behind the crime. He didn't seek glory, he sought permanence. And in that he succeeded. Lucky Luciano didn't just rewrite the Mafia's code. He redefined what it means to rule in silence. Fade to black.